Brother mocked me at Thanksgiving dinner until my phone rang. You know how they say you never really know someone until money gets involved? Yeah, well, they're not wrong. I'm talking dead on accurate. The kind of accurate that hits you like a sledgehammer to the gut when you're standing in your dead father's study, watching your own brother calculate how much he can screw you over. My name's Mark, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the dumbest guy in a room is actually the smartest one there. Let me paint you a picture. Early November, 3 weeks after Dad's funeral. The leaves are doing that thing where they're half brown, half clinging to life, scatter across the lawn where me and Steve used to play catch. The house smells like it always did. Old wood, coffee that's been reheated too many times, and that specific scent of motor oil that Dad could never quite wash off his hands, no matter how hard he tried. I'm standing by the window in Dad's study, still wearing my work boots because I came straight from the job site. There's concrete dust on my jeans. My hands are rough, calloused, the kind of hands that know what real work feels like. I can see the yard from here. The grass needs mowing. Dad would have hated that. Behind me, Steve is sitting at Dad's desk like he owns the place, which technically he's about to. My brother showed up in a suit that probably cost more than my truck payment. It's one of those slim-fit numbers at consultants where when they want you to know, they make six figures. The fabric looks expensive. Too expensive. The kind of expensive that makes you wonder if the guy wearing it has ever changed his own oil. Steve's got his iPad out, fingers dancing across the screen like he's conducting a symphony of spreadsheets. The blue light from that thing makes his face look cold. Calculating. He's always been a numbers guy. Graduated top of his class. Landed some fancy job at a consulting firm downtown. Married a woman who says things like summer as a verb. Me? I'm a general contractor. I pour foundations, frame houses, fix things that are broken. Dad used to say I had good hands. Hands that could build something that lasts. Steve clears his throat. It's that specific sound people make when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. I've heard before, usually right before someone tries to lowball me on a job. He starts talking about this state, about assets and liabilities, about market valuations and opportunity costs. He's using words like liquidity and tax optimization. I just keep looking out the window, watching a squirrel try to bury a nut in the same spot where Dad planted Mom's rose bush 20 years ago. Steve swivels the iPad toward me. There's an Excel spreadsheet on the screen, all color-coded cells and formulas. Red numbers. Lots of red numbers. He taps the screen with his index finger, leaving a small smudge that he immediately wipes away with his tie. The way he explains it, Dad left us with a mess. The house? It's old, needs work, and the market's soft. Real soft. He's got comparables pulled up, showing me how property values in the neighborhood have been declining, 3% year over year. He shows me photos of the cracked foundation, the roof that needs replacing, the ancient furnace that's basically held together with duct tape and prayers. Then he gets to the real kicker, the season tickets. Dad had season tickets to our local football team, not the fancy club seats or anything, just regular seats in section 214, row K, same seats he'd had since I was 7 years old, same seats where he taught me how to keep score, how to read a defense, how to spot when a coach was about to do something stupid. Steve pulls up another spreadsheet. This one's titled Estate Liabilities. Right there at the top, stadium seat licenses. The number next to it makes Steve wince like he's describing a medical condition. $18,000. That's what it costs to maintain the personal seat license, the right to buy those tickets every year. 18 grand for the privilege of sitting in plastic seats watching our team lose. Steve leans back in Dad's chair. It creaks. Dad's chair always creaked. Steve doesn't seem to notice, or maybe he doesn't care. He steeples his fingers like some movie lawyer about to deliver bad news. He tells me he's doing me a favor. His exact words. A favor. He says the house is basically a teardown. The land's only valuable to developers who'd scrape it clean anyway. And those season tickets? Pure liability. Dead weight. A black hole that's been sucking money out of Dad's account for 2 decades while we watched our team post losing season after losing season. Here's the thing about Steve. He reads Bloomberg. He listens to podcasts about disruption and market efficiency. He knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. You know what I mean? He can tell you what something costs down to the penny, but he can't tell you what it's worth. I'm still standing by the window. I haven't said much. Steve mistakes my silence for stupidity. He always has. When we were kids, he got straight A's while I struggled through algebra. He went to state college on a scholarship, while I learned how to frame a wall at the community technical school. In Steve's world, there are smart people and there are people who work with their hands. He's never understood that sometimes those are the same people. Steve keeps talking. He says he'll take the house, the land, the bank accounts, all the complicated stuff that requires lawyers and accountants. He says he'll handle the estate taxes, the probate, all that paperwork that would just confuse someone like me. And in exchange, I can have Dad's truck, that old Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles on it, and the toolbox in the garage. Oh, and those wonderful season tickets with their $18,000 anchor dragging behind them. He even says he'll write it off as charitable giving on his taxes, like he's doing humanitarian work. Like I'm some kind of nonprofit organization dedicated to being taken advantage of by my own brother. The funny thing? I almost laughed. Right there in Dad's study. I almost burst out laughing. But I didn't. Instead, I did what I do best. I stayed quiet. I listened, and I remembered something. See, about a week before this whole meeting, I was on a job site. We were pouring a foundation for a commercial development on the east side of town, not far from the old stadium. It was early morning, that time when the concrete's still workable and the sun hasn't turned everything into a furnace yet. I was drinking coffee with Ray, one of the surveyors I've known for 15 years. Ray's one of those guys who knows everything about what's being built where. He's got the maps, the permits, the inside scoop on every major development in the metro area. We're standing there watching the mixer truck do its thing, and Ray mentions something casual. Just drops it into conversation like it's nothing. He tells me there's been some interesting activity around the stadium district. New utility surveys, underground infrastructure mapping, the kind of preliminary work that happens about 2 years before something big goes down. Ray says the patterns look familiar, like what they did before they built that new arena downtown, the one that turned a neighborhood of abandoned warehouses into the hottest real estate in the city. Ray doesn't say anything definite. He's too smart for that, but he gives me this look, you know? The look that says he's telling me something important without actually saying it. Then he shows me the survey maps on his tablet. All those new lines running around the stadium property. Water, power, fiber optic, the infrastructure for something major. I didn't think much about it at the time. Or maybe I did think about it, but I filed it away in that part of my brain where you keep things that might matter later. The part where you store the weight-bearing capacity of different lumber grades, and which subcontractors show up on time, and which Chinese restaurant gives you the most food for $20. But standing in Dad's study, listening to Steve explain how worthless those season tickets are, Ray's words come back to me crystal clear. Steve reads the financial papers. He knows yesterday's numbers. Me? I listen to the guys who dig the holes. I know what's coming before it's announced. Steve sees what's already happened. I see what's being built. There's something else, too. Something Steve doesn't understand because he never really knew Dad. Not the way I did. Dad wasn't a sophisticated guy. He didn't play the stock market. He didn't have investment properties or a diversified portfolio. He had a house, a truck, a toolbox, and those season tickets. That was it. His entire legacy boiled down to things you could touch, things that did something, things that meant something. And Dad was sharp. Not book smart like Steve, but sharp in a way that matters when you're trying to survive in a world that's constantly trying to take advantage of you. Dad understood people. He understood that Steve would always see him as the old man who never amounted to much. He understood that Steve would swoop in after the funeral with his spreadsheets and his market analysis and his tax optimization strategies. So, standing there in that study, I started to wonder, what if Dad knew exactly what he was doing? What if those season tickets weren't just nostalgia? What if they were a test? Steve's still talking. He's explaining how he'll structure the division of assets, how he'll handle the estate settlement, how clean and simple this can all be. He slides a document across the desk. It's already printed out, already got a signature on it. All it needs is mine. I walk over to the desk for the first time since I got here. My boots sound heavy on the hardwood floor. I pick up the document. It's several pages, stapled in the corner, full of legal language that probably means Steve gets everything worth having, and I get everything that isn't. I look at Steve. Really look at him. His hair is perfectly styled. His nails are clean. There's not a single thing about him that suggests he's ever done a hard day's work. And I think about Dad, with his rough hands, his permanent tan line where his wedding ring used to be after Mom passed, and his stubborn insistence on keeping those season tickets year after year, even when the team was terrible and his friends told him it was throwing good money after bad. I ask Steve one question. Just one. I ask if we can add a clause. Full waiver of future claims. Basically, once we sign this, neither of us can come back later and say the other guy got a better deal. No backsies. No renegotiation. What's done is done. Steve actually laughs. Not a cruel laugh. Exactly. More like the laugh of someone who's so sure they're the smartest person in the room that they can afford to be generous. He says, sure, no problem. He even offers to type it up right there on his iPad, pulls up some document template, adds a clause, prints it out on Dad's old printer that takes forever to warm up and makes that grinding noise like it's dying. We both sign. Steve's signature is this elaborate thing with loops and flourishes. Mine's just my name, barely legible, written the way you write when you've signed 1,000 contractor agreements and you just want to get it done. Steve shakes my hand. His palm is soft. He tells me I'm making the right choice. He says I should be grateful he's handling all the complicated stuff. He says if I ever need financial advice, I should call him. Maybe he can help me set up a Roth IRA or something. I fold the document, put it in my jacket pocket. I look around Dad's study one more time. The books on the shelves that Dad never read, but kept anyway, because they look substantial. The photos on the wall of him and Mom at their wedding, young and happy, and with no idea what was coming. The coffee mug on the desk with the faded logo of a company that went out of business in the 90s. Steve's already packing up his iPad, checking his phone, probably calculating how quickly he can get the house listed and flip it to some developer. He's in a hurry. He's always in a hurry. Places to be, people to see, money to make. I head for the door. The house feels different now. Emptier, like it knows it's about to stop being a home and turn into an investment property. Outside, the November air hits me cold. The sun's getting low. That weak autumn light that doesn't warm anything. I walk to Dad's truck. My truck now, I guess. The Ford's been sitting in the driveway since the funeral. The paint's faded where the sun hits it, and there's a dent in the tailgate from when Dad backed into a post at the hardware store and never bothered to fix it because it didn't affect how the truck worked. I open the driver's door. It creaks. Everything about this truck creaks. The seat's worn in the exact shape of Dad's body, and sitting in it feels like wearing his jacket. I can smell him in here. Old Spice and coffee, and that motor oil smell that never quite went away. I put the folded document on the passenger seat. The papers sit there in the fading light. Just another piece of paper in a world full of contracts and agreements and deals that seem fair until later when they're not. I turn the key. The engine coughs, then catches. It runs rough for a second, then settles into that familiar rumble. 200,000 miles, and this engine still starts every time. Dad took care of things. Made sure they lasted. Made sure they were there when you needed them. I sit there for a moment with my hands on the wheel. They're my hands, but they look like Dad's hands. Same scars, same calluses, same shape. The hands of men who build things. Through the windshield, I can see the house. Steve's still inside, probably already on the phone with a real estate agent. He thinks he won. But here's what Steve doesn't know. Sometimes the smartest move looks like the dumbest one. And sometimes your dad leaves you something that looks like a burden, but is actually a gift, if you're smart enough to see it. I put the truck in reverse. The transmission clunks. I back out of the driveway. The house gets smaller in the rearview mirror. I drive through the old neighborhood, past the park where Dad taught me to ride a bike, past the corner store where we get ice cream after Little League games, past all the landmarks of a childhood that's over, in a place that's moving on whether I'm ready or not. My phone sitting in the cup holder, silent and dark. In a few weeks, it's going to light up with a message that changes everything. But right now, I'm just a guy driving his dad's old truck, heading home with a piece of paper in his pocket. There's a saying Dad used to quote. Maybe he made it up. He'd say it whenever things look bad. The best deals are the ones where the other guy thinks they won. I didn't understand it back then. I thought a deal was either good or bad. I didn't understand that sometimes you play the long game. The truck rumbles down the street. The heater's starting to work, blowing warm air that smells like dust and old memories. I think about those season tickets. $18,000. Steve sees a hole in the budget. But I think about Ray and his survey maps, about infrastructure and development patterns, about timing and patience. Most of all, I think about Dad sitting in those seats, game after game, year after year, paying that fee even when money was tight. Was he crazy? Or did he know something nobody else could see? Steve thinks he's the smart one. He's got the education, the career, the spreadsheets, everything except the one thing that matters. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. Me? I'm just a contractor. But I know how to read a building site. I know when something's about to change. I know the difference between price and value. The sun's almost down now. The streetlights are coming on, that yellow glow that makes everything look older than it is. Tomorrow I've got a job starting early, another foundation, another building going up, and in a few weeks, after Thanksgiving, after Steve's had time to enjoy his victory, that's when things get interesting. That's when the phone rings. That's when Steve realizes that sometimes the trash your brother lets you stick in what turns out to be treasure. But we're not there yet. The engine rumbles. The document sits on the passenger seat, signed and sealed. And somewhere I think Dad's smiling, because he knew all along how this would play out. You want to know the secret to winning? Be patient. Know what you know. Trust your gut. And never let the smart guys realize you're smarter than they think. I turn onto my street. Home's just ahead. Everything else? That's a story for another day. Steve got the house. I got the lesson. We'll see who comes out ahead. Thanksgiving came 3 weeks later, and Steve invited me to dinner at Dad's old house. Except it wasn't Dad's house anymore. Not really. I pulled up in the Ford around 4 in the afternoon. The sun was already getting low. That weak November light that makes everything look tired. The house looked different. Steve had contractors in there the day after the papers were signed. New paint, new shutters. The lawn was professionally landscaped now. Those perfectly edged hedges that looked like they were cut with laser level. The place looked expensive. It also looked dead. I walked up to the front door. Same door I'd walked through 1,000 times as a kid. But now there was a new brass knocker where Dad's old doorbell used to be. I used it. The sound echoed inside like I was visiting a museum. Steve opened the door wearing an apron that still had the creases from the package. He was trying to look casual, but everything about him screamed staged. The kind of casual that costs money to fake. He welcomed me in like I was a guest instead of his brother. Showed me where to put my coat. Asked if I wanted a drink. The whole house smelled wrong. Not bad, just wrong. Instead of turkey roasting and Mom's old recipe for stuffing, it smelled like catering. Like food that was made somewhere else and delivered in aluminum trays. The dining room was set up like something out of a magazine. White tablecloth, fancy plates. Those napkins folded into shapes that nobody actually needs. And sitting around the table were people I'd never met. Steve's colleagues from a consulting firm, men in expensive casual wear, the kind of shirts that cost $200 to look like they cost $40. And at the head of the table, in Dad's old spot, sat Mr. Harrison. I recognized him from the firm's website. Silver hair, sharp eyes, the kind of guy who'd build a success back when a handshake still meant something. He was probably in his 60s, wearing a cardigan that looked older than Steve's entire wardrobe. There was something solid about him. Real. Steve introduced everyone. Names I forgot immediately. Brad or Chad or some variation. A couple of wives with perfect teeth and tennis bracelets. Everyone smiled at me with that polite distance you give to someone you've been told to be nice to. Then Steve did the seating arrangement. Everyone had their spot. Everyone except me. Steve looked around the table with this perfectly practiced expression of surprise, like he just realized something. He said they must have miscounted, must have forgotten a chair. No big deal, though. He'd fix it. He disappeared into the garage and came back with a folding chair. One of those metal ones with a vinyl padding that squeaks when you move. The kind you use when actual furniture runs out. The kind that says you're an afterthought. He set it up at the corner of the table, right where the table leg supports are. I sat down and immediately felt it. The chair was lower than the regular dining chairs. Just a few inches, but enough. Enough that everyone else was looking slightly down at me. Enough that the table edge hit me wrong. Enough that the table leg pressed right into my knee. It was brilliant, really. A masterclass in humiliation. Quiet, deniable, but unmistakable. I sat there while everyone made small talk about the market and interest rates and some deal somebody was closing. I didn't say much, just nodded when appropriate. Ate the catered turkey that tasted like every other catered turkey I'd ever had. Professional, competent, forgettable. Then Mr. Harrison turned to me. He had this way of looking at you like he was actually interested, not just killing time until he could talk about himself. He asked what I did for work. I told him. General contractor. Residential and commercial foundations, mostly. Some framing. Whatever needs doing. Harrison nodded slowly. He said his father started out as a mason, worked with his hands his whole life, built half the downtown area back in the day, one brick at a time. He said there was honor in that, in making something real, something that lasts. The table got quiet. Steve's friends didn't know what to do with that. You could see them trying to figure out if Harrison was being sincere or setting up some kind of joke. Steve jumped in fast, changed the subject, started talking about some project the firm was working on, something about optimization and synergy and all those words that sound important but don't actually mean anything. But I caught Harrison's eye for a second. There was something there. Respect, maybe. Recognition. Like he saw something in me that reminded him of his old man. The folding chair kept digging into my knee. I shifted my weight. The vinyl squeaked. One of Steve's colleagues smirked into his wine glass. Dinner dragged on. The catered turkey was followed by catered sides and catered dessert. Everything was perfect. Everything was plastic. I thought about Mom's Thanksgivings. The chaos of it. The smoke alarm going off because she always forgot about the rolls. Dad carving the turkey at the same table. Making a joke about how he was better with a circular saw than a carving knife. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a performance. And I was the prop Steve brought in to show how magnanimous he was. Look at me, having my blue-collar brother over. Look how generous I am. Look how far I've come from where we started. Then Steve decided to tell the story. He'd had a few glasses of wine by this point, just enough to make him loud, just enough to make him confident. He announced at the table that they had to hear this story about the estate settlement, about his sentimental brother, who couldn't let go of the past. He told them about the season tickets, about how Dad had these seats at the stadium for decades, watching our team lose year after year, about how it cost $18,000 just to maintain the license, about how Steve had generously offered to take on all the complicated assets, the house, the land, the finances, and how I had insisted on taking the tickets, spent my last dime keeping them active. He said it like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. $18,000 for plastic seats and overpriced hot dogs. He said he'd offer me investment opportunities, tried to teach me about building wealth, but I'd chosen nostalgia over sense. The table laughed. Not everyone, not Harrison, but enough. Enough that I could feel their judgment. The poor blue-collar guy who doesn't understand money, who clings to the past because he can't handle the future. Steve was loving it. He'd built up to this moment. This was his punchline, his proof that he was the smart brother, the successful one, the one who escaped. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting a text from a buddy or a spam call about my car's extended warranty. But it was an email, official letterhead. from the team's front office. The subject line read, "Important update regarding your legacy season ticket license." I opened it, read it once, then read it again to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The email explained that the city and the team had finalized plans for a new stadium, the Titan Dome, state of the art, opening in 2 years. And here's the important part. All legacy ticket holders, anyone with licenses dating back to the original stadium agreement, were being upgraded to Diamond Legacy status. Diamond Legacy came with a few perks: premium seats in the new stadium, access to club lounges, priority parking, and the big one, a transferable license that could be sold on the secondary market. No new fees, no buy-in costs, grandfathered in under the old contract. The email included an estimate of the current market value for such licenses. The number had a lot of digits, more than I made in a year, more than I'd made in several years. But that's not what hit me. Not the money. What hit me was the understanding. Dad knew. Somehow he knew. Maybe he didn't know the specifics. Maybe he didn't know about the Titan Dome or Diamond Legacy status or any of the details. But he knew something was coming. He'd kept those tickets through good times and bad, through seasons where our team was competitive and seasons where they were a joke. He'd kept them when it made sense and when it didn't. And he'd structured the inheritance so that Steve would see them as garbage, so that Steve would practically beg me to take them, so that Steve would sign papers saying he had no claim to them, ever, under any circumstances. Dad had known his sons, known exactly who they were, and he'd built a test into his death, a test that would reveal character when money got involved. I sat there in my squeaky folding chair, knee pressed against the table leg, and felt something warm spread through my chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just warmth, like Dad had reached across from wherever he was and put his hand on my shoulder. Steve was still talking, still riding high on his story about the foolish brother and the worthless tickets. The table was still chuckling, still playing their parts in Steve's little performance. I looked at Harrison. He wasn't laughing. He was watching me, watching the way I was looking at my phone, the expression on my face. He was too sharp to miss it, too experienced not to recognize the exact moment when the script flips. I put my phone back in my pocket, picked up my water glass. The table was winding down from Steve's story, moving on to other topics. But I wasn't ready to let the moment pass. I stood up. The folding chair scraped against the floor. Everyone looked at me. I raised my glass of water. No wine, no champagne, just tap water in a crystal glass that probably cost more than my work boots. I said I wanted to make a toast to family, to Steve and his generosity in hosting this beautiful dinner, to new beginnings and old memories, and most of all, to the idea that everyone eventually gets exactly what they deserve. I looked right at Steve when I said that last part. He was smiling, but there was something behind his eyes. Uncertainty, like he'd heard something in my tone that didn't match my words. Harrison raised his glass. So did everyone else. We drank. The moment passed. But something had shifted. I could feel it. Harrison kept glancing at me throughout the rest of the evening. Steve kept trying to recapture the energy from his big story, but it was gone. The air had changed. I stayed another hour, talked to a few people, thanked Steve for dinner, shook Harrison's hand on the way out. His grip was firm. He held it a second longer than necessary and told me it was good to meet someone who understood the value of loyalty. Outside, the November air was cold and clean. The sun had set. The street lights were on. I climbed into Ford and just sat there for a minute, engine off, in the driveway of the house that used to be home. My phone was still in my pocket. The email was still there. The numbers were still real. But the money wasn't what mattered. What mattered was understanding. Dad had seen Steve for exactly what he was, had seen me for exactly what I was, and he left us both exactly what we needed. Steve got the house and the land and the bank accounts. All the things you can count and measure and optimize. All the things that look good on paper. I got the lesson. I got the knowledge that somebody understood me. Somebody believed I was worth protecting. Somebody knew that I'd figure out when the time came. That folding chair had dug into my knee for 2 hours. I'd been the punchline of Steve's story. I'd been looked down on, literally and figuratively, by a table full of people who thought they were better than me, and none of it mattered. Not anymore. I started the engine. The old Ford rumbled to life. I backed out of the driveway one more time, watching the house disappear in the rearview mirror. Somewhere in that expensive, remodeled, professionally decorated house, Steve was cleaning up from his perfect Thanksgiving, congratulating himself on a successful dinner, probably already thinking about how much he could sell the place for, already calculating his next move. He had no idea. None at all. And that was exactly how it needed to be. For now, I drove home through empty streets, the phone heavy in my pocket, carrying the weight of everything that was about to change. The secret sat there warm and patient, waiting for exactly the right moment to come out. There's something Dad used to say, usually when he was teaching me how to use a new tool or explaining why you measure twice and cut once. He'd say, timing isn't everything, but everything is timing. I didn't understand it then. But sitting in that folding chair, feeling the email arrive at the exact moment Steve was mocking me to his friends, I understood it perfectly. The streets were quiet. Most people were still with their families, digesting turkey and pie, watching football, doing all the things you're supposed to do on Thanksgiving. Normal people. People whose families actually liked each other. I wasn't bitter about it. Not anymore. Some families show love by gathering around a table. Some families show love by leaving behind a test that proves someone actually knew who you were. I'd take the second kind any day. The Ford hummed down the highway. My knees still ached from the table leg. My pride still stung from being the evening's entertainment. But underneath all that was something solid, something sure, something that felt a lot like victory, even though the game wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But it would be soon enough. And what it was, Steve was to learn a lesson that all his fancy education never taught him. Sometimes the dumbest guy at the table is the only one who really understands what's happening. I smiled, just a little, just enough. Dad would have appreciated that. The day after Thanksgiving is when America loses its mind. Black Friday. People lining up at midnight to fight over discounted TVs they don't need. Parking lots turning into demolition derbies. The whole country in a frenzy to buy stuff on sale that wasn't worth full price to begin with. Me, I was in my garage, working on a fishing rod. The radio was on, playing that mix of classic rock and local news that keeps you company without demanding attention. I had the garage door open despite the cold, because I like the smell of November air. Clean, sharp, honest. The fishing rod was Dad's. The reel was seized up from sitting in his shed too long. I had it disassembled on my workbench. Parts laid out in order, cleaning each piece with the patience you learn when you work with your hands. Some things you can't rush. Some things you fix properly or not at all. The radio DJ wrapped up a song and switched to news. The morning's top story was about the stadium. The official announcement had dropped at midnight, timed perfectly for maximum media coverage. The Titan Dome, a $2.3 billion project, public-private partnership, opening in 26 months. The works. The reporter interviewed some city official who used words like revitalization and economic impact and sustainable development. Translation. A bunch of rich people found a way to get richer while convincing everyone else it was good for them. But buried in the announcement was the detail that mattered. The legacy ticket holders. The people who'd stuck with the team through decades of mediocrity. They were being honored with grandfather clause protections. Premium seats in the new stadium. Transferable licenses. No new buy-in required. The reporter mentioned that similar licenses in other cities were trading for 6 figures. Sometimes 7, depending on the market. I kept working on the reel, hands moving automatically while my brain did the math. The email from Thanksgiving had given me estimates. Conservative estimates, probably, since the team wouldn't want to create unrealistic expectations. But now that the announcement was public, now that the details were out there, those numbers weren't estimates anymore. They were real. Here's the thing about grandfather clauses. They're basically a cheat code built into the system. A legal time machine. You know how sometimes you hear stories about someone finding stock certificates in their attic, shares their grandfather bought in some company that later became huge? That's what this was. Dad's season tickets. The ones he bought back when the stadium was new and the team was terrible and you could get seats for the price of a decent dinner. Those tickets had a clause in the original contract, a protection, a promise. When the team was desperate for fans, they made deals that seemed generous because they never thought the seats would be worth anything. It's like finding Apple stock in Steve Jobs' garage, back when nobody thought a computer company would matter. You get the dividends not because you're smart today, but because someone believed back when belief was cheap. Dad believed. Or maybe he just liked football. Either way, he kept paying that annual fee year after year, even when it seemed pointless. Especially when it seemed pointless. And now that $18,000 in maintenance costs had transformed into something else entirely. For $100,000, that's what the email had estimated. For $100,000 for plastic seats and overpriced beer, and the privilege of watching our team lose in comfort. Except we weren't going to lose anymore. New stadium, new energy, new everything. The city was going all in. And the legacy holders were grandfathered into the ground floor of something that was about to explode in value. Steve had seen the liability, the cost, the burden of the past. Dad had seen the future. Or at least, he'd bet on it. Same thing, really. I was fitting the clean parts back together, feeling them click into place with that satisfying precision of well-made machinery, when my phone rang. Steve's name on the screen. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. The voice that came through wasn't the confident, condescending Steve from Thanksgiving. This was a different Steve, a panicked Steve. The Steve who appears when spreadsheets stop making sense, and the world doesn't follow the formulas. He asked if I'd seen the news. His voice had that tight quality you get when you're trying very hard not to scream. I said I'd heard something on the radio. He told me Harrison had called him this morning, early, before Steve had even finished his coffee. Harrison had seen the announcement, had done the math, had realized that the consulting firm needed a corporate box in the new stadium. Premium seats for clients, for networking, for closing deals. And Harrison remembered, from Thanksgiving dinner, the story Steve had told about the family's season tickets, about how Steve's brother had taken them as part of the estate settlement. Harrison wanted those tickets, wanted them bad, had made it very clear that Steve needed to make it happen. Steve's voice was climbing in pitch, getting faster. He said Harrison was furious. Said the firm couldn't afford to buy new licenses at market rate. Said the legacy grandfather clause seats were the only way to get premium placement without spending 7 figures. He said Harrison expected results. Expected Steve to use his family connections. Expected Steve to solve this problem because Steve was the one who brought it up in the first place. The irony was so thick you could pour it over pancakes. Steve asked if I'd seen any emails from the team, any updates about the tickets. I looked at the disassembled fishing reel on my workbench, the parts all cleaned and ready to go back together, everything in its place. I told Steve I'd gotten an email, mentioned something about legacy status. I'd been meaning to look into it. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause where you can hear someone's brain trying to process information their ego doesn't want to accept. Steve asked what I wanted. Just like that. No pretense. No games. What did I want? I thought about it. Really thought about it. Not about the money, though that was nice. Not about revenge, though that had its appeal. I thought about Dad. About what he'd want. About what this test was really measuring. I told Steve he should come over. We should talk in person. Steve said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Then he said something else. Said we could fix this. Said the estate settlement had obviously been a mistake. Said we could redo the paperwork. Split things more fairly. Said family was more important than some old contract. I let him talk. Let him build his case. Let him think he was negotiating. Then I said the only thing that mattered. I told him to bring the settlement papers, the ones we'd both signed. I wanted to review the exact terms. I could hear Steve's relief through the phone. He thought that meant I was willing to deal, willing to renegotiate. He said he'd bring everything. Said we'd figure this out together. I told him that sounded good, that I'd see him soon. Then I added one more thing. Told him this wasn't a mistake. Told him it was business. The line went quiet for a second. Then Steve said he'd be right over and hung up. I went back to the fishing reel. Put it back together slowly, methodically, the way Dad had taught me. When something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. No shortcuts. No rushing. Just patience and attention and respect for the tools you're using. The reel clicked together perfectly. I gave it a test spin. Smooth as butter. Better than new, actually, because new things haven't been broken in yet. Haven't learned how to work. I put the rod aside and went inside to make coffee. Strong coffee. The kind that keeps you sharp when you need to be. 23 minutes later, Steve's car pulled into my driveway. Not the sedan he usually drove. His wife's SUV. The expensive one with the third-row seating and the premium sound system. He must have been at home when Harrison called. Must have run out the door the moment we hung up. He climbed out of the car, carrying a leather portfolio. His hair was messy. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt. No jacket, despite the cold. This wasn't the Steve who showed up to Thanksgiving with creased aprons and stage casualness. This was Steve unraveled. I opened the door before he could knock. Gestured him inside. My place isn't much. A small house I bought a decade ago. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. Kitchen with appliances at work, but won't win any design awards. The furniture is comfortable. The TV is adequate. Everything serves its purpose without pretending to be something it's not. Steve looked around like he was visiting a third-world country. The same way he looked at Dad's house before he renovated it into something sterile and expensive. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table I'd found at a yard sale for $40. Solid oak underneath the worn finish. The kind of table that lasts. Steve put his portfolio down. Opened it. Pulled out the settlement documents. He'd highlighted sections. Made notes in the margins. Come prepared for negotiation. He started talking immediately. Said he'd been thinking about the estate settlement. Said it had been rushed. Said grief had clouded both our judgments. Said the fair thing, the right thing, would be to revisit the terms. He said he was willing to give me money. Real money. Enough to make a difference in my life. $50,000 for the season tickets. Cash. Right now. Today. I didn't say anything. Just looked at him. Waited. Steve mistook my silence for consideration. He upped the offer. $75,000. His voice was getting desperate. Said he could have the money transferred today. Said we could draw up new paperwork. Make everything official. I asked if he brought the original settlement documents. The ones we signed in Dad's study. Steve nodded. Pushed them across the table. Pointed to the sections about asset distribution. Started explaining how estate settlements could be amended within certain time frames under certain conditions. I flipped past all that. Went to the last page. The addendum we'd added. The clause I'd requested. Full waiver of future claims. I pulled a highlighter from the kitchen drawer. Yellow. The same color Steve had used on his copy. I dragged it across his signature. Nice and slow. Made sure it was visible. Steve stopped talking. Watched the highlighter move across his own name. I read the clause out loud. About how both parties agreed that the settlement was final. That neither party could claim the other had received unfair advantage. That all future rights and claims were permanently waived. Steve started to say something about technicalities. About contract law. About how surely we could work something out between brothers. I told him that Harrison hadn't called me. Hadn't reached out directly. Had gone through Steve because Steve was the one who told the story at Thanksgiving. The one who bragged about sticking his dumb brother with the worthless tickets. Steve's face changed. The desperation turned to anger. The kind of anger that comes when someone's ego realizes it's been played. He said I'd manipulated him. Said I'd known about the stadium plans. Said I'd tricked him into signing away valuable assets. I reminded him that he'd done the valuation. He'd prepared the spreadsheets. He'd calculated the worth of every asset in Dad's estate. He'd been the one to declare the tickets worthless. I'd just agreed with his assessment. Steve stood up, started pacing. Said this wasn't over. Said he'd find a lawyer. Said he'd prove I'd had insider information. Said there were laws about this kind of thing. That's when someone knocked on the door. Steve froze. Looked at me. Looked at the door. I stood up, walked to the door, opened it. A kid stood there, college age, wearing a polo shirt with a logo I recognized. The consulting firm, Harrison's company. The kid said he had a delivery from Mark Reynolds. Asked if that was me. I said it was. He handed me a large envelope, the expensive kind with the cardboard backing. Asked me to sign for it. I signed. He left. I closed the door and turned around. Steve was staring at the envelope. I opened it slowly, pulled out the contents. A contract, multiple pages, legal letterhead, a purchase agreement. For one legacy season ticket license. Section 214, Row K, Seats 7 and 8. Buyer, Harrison Capital Consulting Group. Purchase price, for $150,000. The contract was already signed. Harrison's signature at the bottom, bold and confident. All it needed was mine. I looked at Steve. His face had gone white. He asked who that was from, his voice barely working. I told him the truth. Told him I'd gotten a call yesterday, Friday morning, early, from Mr. Harrison himself, not through Steve. Direct. Harrison had seen the stadium announcement, had remembered the Thanksgiving conversation, had remembered Steve's story about his brother and the season tickets. But Harrison was sharp enough to read between the lines, sharp enough to recognize that sometimes a guy everyone thinks is stupid is actually the only one who knows what's happening. Harrison had called me, introduced himself properly, apologized for the folding chair, which he said he'd noticed and hadn't appreciated. Said he'd grown up around men who worked with their hands, and he recognized quality when he saw it. Then he'd made an offer, a straightforward business proposition. He needed the seats. I had them. He'd pay fair market value, maybe a bit more, because he respected loyalty. Loyalty to family. Loyalty to a team through bad years. The kind of loyalty you can't buy but you can recognize. We'd talk for an hour. Not about money, though that came up. About fathers. About legacy. About what it means to honor someone's memory. Harrison told me about his dad, the mason, how his old man had never made much money, but had built half the buildings in the downtown district. How Harrison's success was built on foundation his father had literally poured with his own hands. He understood what Dad had done, understood the test, maybe even understood it better than I did. We'd agreed on price, $450,000, above market but not insulting, fair. He'd had his lawyers draw up the contracts overnight, sent them over first thing this morning. All I had to do was sign. Steve was having trouble breathing. He sat back down, put his head in his hands. He asked why I hadn't told him, why I'd let him come over here, why I'd let him embarrass himself. I told him it was because I wanted him to see it, wanted him to understand. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving I was smarter. It was about the test. Dad had left us both something. Steve got the assets that made sense on paper. The house, the land, the bank accounts. All the stuff you're supposed to want. All the stuff that proves you're successful. I got the test. The thing that looked worthless but wasn't. The thing that required faith instead of calculations. The thing that only paid off if you understood what you were holding. Steve said it wasn't fair. Said Dad should have split things evenly. Said playing favorites was wrong. I asked him if he remembered Thanksgiving. Remembered the folding chair. Remembered telling his friends about his stupid brother who chose hot dogs over investments. Steve looked away. I told him Dad had known exactly who he was. Had known that Steve would see numbers and miss value, would see liability and miss opportunity, would be so focused on looking smart that he'd never actually be wise. And Dad had known me too, had known I'd listen, had known I'd be patient, had known I'd figure it out when the time was right. The test wasn't about the money. It was about character, about who we became when nobody was watching, about what we valued when value wasn't obvious. Steve had failed. Not because he wasn't smart, but because he was so busy being smart that he forgot to be good. There was a long silence. Steve sat there looking at the contract on my table, at the number that could have been his, at the opportunity he'd literally handed to me while making jokes about my stupidity. He asked what I was going to do with the money. I told him the truth. Said I wasn't going to buy a sports car or take some elaborate vacation. Said I was going to pay off my house, invest the rest conservatively, maybe take a fishing trip somewhere nice. And then I told him the other part, the part I decided on this morning, sitting in my garage, listening to news and thinking about what Dad would want. I was setting up education trusts. 2 of them, one for each of Steve's kids. Steve's head snapped up. He stared at me. I explained it to him. Said his kids didn't ask for any of this. Didn't ask for a father who valued money over people, who saw his own brother as a mark, who failed every test of character that mattered. But those kids deserved a chance. Deserved to learn something different. Deserved to have opportunities that didn't come with strings attached. The trust would be substantial. Not the full amount, but enough to pay for college. Enough to give them options. Enough to show them that family could mean something other than what their father had taught them. Steve's eyes were wet. I'd never seen him cry. Not when Mom died. Not at Dad's funeral. But he was close now. He asked why I would do that. Why I'd give money to his kids after everything he'd done. I told him it was because Dad had given me something more valuable than money. Had given me a lesson about who I wanted to be. About the kind of man who looks past the obvious win to find the right win. The right win wasn't keeping Steve's kids from getting educated. The right win was showing them that someone in their family understood what actually mattered. Steve sat there for a long time, not saying anything, just processing, maybe understanding for the first time that he'd been playing the wrong game all along. Eventually, he stood up, gathered his papers, his portfolio. He stopped at the door, turned around. He said he was sorry. Not in the performative way people apologize when they get caught. In the quiet way people apologize when they actually mean it. I told him I knew. Told him the trust documents would be ready in a few weeks. Told him he was welcome to review them. Make sure they were set up properly. Steve nodded. Started to leave. Then stopped again. He asked if Dad had really known. If Dad had planned all this. I thought about it. About Dad sitting in those stadium seats, year after year, paying that fee, keeping the faith. About the way he'd structured this state. About the test he'd built into his death. I told Steve I thought Dad had hoped, had believed, had trusted that his sons would become who they were always going to become, and that one of them might remember what actually matters. Steve left. The door closed behind him. His SUV pulled out of my driveway. I went back to the kitchen table, picked up the contract, found a pen, signed my name on the line. 3 weeks later, I was sitting on my back porch. The mortgage was paid off. The house was mine, free and clear. The trust documents were filed. Harrison's check had cleared. The porch was nothing special, just a concrete slab with a couple of chairs. But it was mine, and it was enough. I had Dad's fishing rod leaning against the wall. The reel worked perfectly now, all cleaned and oiled and ready for whatever came next. There's something they don't tell you about winning. The real wins, the ones that matter, they don't feel like what you expect. They're quieter, simpler. They feel less like triumph and more like peace. I thought about Steve, about his big house and his fancy job, and his perfect life that wasn't perfect at all. About how he'd spent so much time proving he was smart that he'd never learned to be wise. But mostly I thought about Dad, about the test he'd left us, about how he'd known that the best way to teach his sons was to let them teach themselves. Steve had learned that being clever isn't the same as being right, that numbers don't tell the whole story, that sometimes the greatest wealth is knowing what you're willing to lose for what you refuse to compromise. Me? I learned that Dad had seen me, really seen me, had understood who I was and what I valued, and had left me exactly what I needed to prove it to myself. The season tickets were gone now, sold to Harrison, transferred over. The legacy seats would belong to a consulting firm, would be used for clients and deals and all the things that matter in Steve's world. But the legacy itself, that was mine. The understanding that some things are worth more than their price, That faith beats calculation. That the long game always wins if you're patient enough to play it. Dad used to say something when I was a kid. I'd mess up a project, cut something wrong, have to start over. I'd get frustrated, want to quit, and he'd put his hand on my shoulder and say this: "It's not about being right the first time. It's about being willing to learn. And some lessons are worth waiting for." I didn't understand it then. Thought it was just something dads say to make you feel better about failure. But sitting on that porch, thinking about estate settlements and season tickets and tests built into death, I understood it perfectly. Dad's last lesson had taken months to unfold, had required patience and faith and the willingness to look stupid while you waited for everyone else to catch up. And it was worth every second. The sun was setting. November was fading into December. The air was cold and clean. Somewhere in the city, in a renovated house that used to be home, Steve was probably looking at the trust documents I'd sent over, probably trying to understand why someone would give away money to kids who weren't even his own. Maybe someday he'd figure it out. Maybe the next test he faced, he'd do better. But that was his journey, his lesson to learn. Mine was already learned, already understood, already part of who I was. I picked up the fishing rod, gave the reel another spin. Smooth, perfect, ready. There's a saying I came up with, sitting there on that porch. Don't know if anyone said it before, but it felt true in a way that matters. Success is getting what you want. Wisdom is wanting what you get. Steve got success. He wanted it, chased it, structured his whole life around it. I got wisdom. Didn't even know I was chasing it until it found me. And given the choice between the two, I'd take wisdom every time. Because wisdom is what you get when the test is over, and you realize you passed something you didn't even know you were taking. The porch light flickered on automatically as the darkness came. I sat there a while longer, not thinking about much. Just being. Just breathing. Just grateful for a father who'd loved me enough to challenge me. For a brother who'd taught me what not to become. For a test I'd passed without even trying because Dad had raised me to be someone who didn't need to try. Tomorrow I'd go back to work. Pour concrete. Frame walls. Build things at last. But tonight I just sat. Let the lesson settle. Let the peace wash over me. Dad had left me the season tickets. But he'd given me so much more. He'd given me myself. The proof of who I was. The confirmation that the man I'd tried to be was worth being. And that, right there, was worth more than all the stadiums in the world. The fishing rod waited. The mortgage was paid. The trusts were established. Everything was exactly as it should be. Sometimes you win by losing. Sometimes you get rich by giving things away. Sometimes the smartest move is the one that looks dumbest. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, your father leaves you one last lesson disguised as an inheritance. A test that proves you're his son not because of what you took, but because of what you chose to keep. I chose right, kept faith, played the long game. And in the end, that made all the difference.